Yeah, so it is January 10th. It's a new year. And you're wondering, you, the viewer, might be wondering what the hell's going on. Did they lose all their funding? That is not the case. No, it is extraordinary times. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who has been Prime Minister since 2015, 9 years now, has resigned. He's announced his resignment, not just as Prime Minister, but as leader of the Liberal Party. And Drew and I thought this would be a great time to talk about some of the Liberals' policies on some key issues for Montrealers, as well as potential avenues forward from the potential next Prime Minister, the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, MP for Carleton, just a kind of a rural suburb outside of Ottawa. Yeah, let's get right into it. Housing, big issue for Canadians, Montrealers. Rent in Montreal is up. Rent is Montreal is up very specific. Has it almost what was it years ago? Rent almost doubled in 6 years in Montreal. In 20, what was it? It used to be the average rent is now 1,176, where it used to be 809. And so we can see that the rent is absolutely going up. What has Trudeau done for housing? Trudeau and the Liberals kind of do that classic thing of means testing kind of policies. So that's like they have these benefits that they want to give. Means testing is like they want to have benefits that the government wants to give, but you have to fit many a specific criteria. It's always a classic thing. At least on my end, I think for Liberals to have these kinds of specific ways of doling out benefits. One example is, let's say, the first-time home buyers benefit, which is if you're the first time buying a home, you don't got to pay GST. That's just one of the ways that Liberals went about it. Pierre, on the other hand, Pierre is announcing that he's going to use a carrot and stick approach, where if the Liberals benefit the subsidies, the kind of incentives rather, or the carrot, then Pierre also has a stick that he's going to whack people with. But who's he whacking? He's whacking municipalities. Maybe not whacking. That's like a. I feel like there's like mob uh, implications to that. But he's going to chastise municipalities for not building enough. This plan was specifically like if municipalities are not building something around 15%, if they are under 10% of new real estate developments per year, then they will get chastised and given less money by the government. Where if a municipality is found to have constructed 15 or more percent, then they will get more benefits. Drew, quick thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental idea here, really behind both of the liberal and the conservative plans, but certainly more emphasized in the conservative plan, is the idea that if you increase the number of private developers building housing, that the cost of housing will somehow go down. And I think there's a lot of evidence that this is basically not true. I mean, starting with the fact that like whenever a private housing developer, you know, explores whether to build new housing, they do an assessment of the saturation of housing in that area. They look at they evaluate basically whether they're going to be increasing supply beyond what can be absorbed by the current market rate, because that is how they protect their investment. And so it might slow the increase slightly of housing price increases, but it's not going to do more than that. And housing is, I think, already out of reach for most people. And it's fundamentally I think the fundamental problem is that if you leave housing supply to the market, you're going to get people speculating on housing supply. And as a result, the incentive of all the people putting that capital into building housing is for housing to continue to get more expensive,
Mm-hmm.
and at an outsized rate, because you need that return on investment. That's why you're putting the money in. By contrast, if you do basically as the federal government did before, the early 1990s, when there was a sort of a 1-2 punch of liberal and conservative governments, or conservative and then liberal governments cutting the heart out of nonprofit housing funding at the federal level in Canada. Um, before that, you had the federal government putting a lot of money into co-op housing, into social housing, and basically maintaining a floor in the housing market to say, okay, there's always going to be a supply of affordable housing for the people who need it, and then sort of if people want to dabble in the private market beyond that, then they can. But we've taken that option away. They basically cut the heart out of that option, and successive liberal and conservative governments have kept kept housing as a speculative commodity, which has been, I think financially good to some extent for homeowners. People who bought homes in the 80s or 90s and saw that price appreciate like massively over the last few decades. To the extent that becomes sort of the retirement plan and everything else. And so people
Mm-hmm.
become dependent on homes increasing in value. And of course, once people buy homes at exorbitantly inflated prices, then of course they want those prices to keep inflating, which, basically becomes a Ponzi scheme at some point because somebody's going to have to pay the price of that ever increasing housing price. And in the meantime, the only people who can buy houses are people who already have houses that are in absurdly inflated prices, that are absurdly inflated valuations that they can then sell for those prices or borrow money on. So it's been this ever spiraling thing, and I guess specifically I want to get into the sort of the current juncture that we're at in terms of like the federal scene. You have Trudeau stepping down, and I think Trudeau is a master of maintaining the status quo. He really, obviously he's done some pretty big moves in some sense, and huge rhetorical shifts in terms of adopting the language of movements over the years, especially Indigenous movements, which we'll hear about in a little bit, but also the sort of language of progressivism without any of the substance of it. And so you have this real sort of, I think that results in this sort of scattershot approach where they know they have to do something about housing, but they can't address the elephant in the room, which is this housing as commodity treadmill, that
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of their voter base is on. And so Trudeau stepped down, and you have Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, the putative sort of front runners for the leadership race, who are true believers in the market and likely to sort of impose more austerity on government provision of housing, if anything. And then you have Pierre Poilievre, who is an absolute free market ideologue and who
Mm-hmm.
thinks that you can increase supply, or reduce demand by getting the market and then private investors to increase in supply and somehow trick themselves into not making less money, which is, I think I tried to outline earlier, but like, absurd and historically unprecedented. So yeah, so in terms of the effect on Montreal's sort of doubling in housing prices, I think we're going to, no matter whether we elect, whether Polyev comes into power or whether it's another liberal, or to some extent the NDP, because they're not addressing this fundamentally either. You're going to continue to see the housing crisis deepen, until there's either a crash or we end up with a sort of a neo-feudal society where only people who have parents who are homeowners basically get to buy a house, which is where we're rapidly going to at this point.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that thing about this is just across North America, not just Canada as well, but the children of parents who have properties, when their parents pass away, it's going to be one of the largest like generational wealth transfers, right? And it's like I think it's that's a testament to how locked out so many younger people are feeling out. Like they're just completely locked out of a housing market. A lot of people I've spoken to who are either Gen Z or young millennials. It's not really a prospect. It's not really something in their lives that they can even plan for to buy a house. And it's not that they don't want to. It's not like a lifestyle choice. It's more like a choice that's already made for them just by virtue of how exorbitant housing prices are becoming, right? And I think we get into a bit of the kind of the issue, I think, with how successive governments have tried to deal with housing, and that because for most average people, the house, their real estate, is going to be the biggest kind of like chunk of their net worth, right? The biggest thing in their portfolio, and even portfolio might be like pushing a little bit, but it's just like the most valuable thing they're going to own, right? So trying to push down that, it kind of it's going to affect like so many, because I don't know, like people who have just like one home, right? But then of course there's it's not to say that's the only kind of homeowner in Canada, right? It's not the only kind of person who owns property in Canada. And the on the other side of things, you have like more and more of these big gigantic holding companies, right, that like just buy purchase real estate at like like because they have the capital, the money to be able to play in this kind of field, even though housing is so
The real
expensive.
estate investment trusts, yeah.
Exactly, the REITs, right? Yeah, there's lots of great articles I've read about the REITification of the housing market, right? And that more and more and more, it's not just like it's not you're not dealing with a landlord who just owns like one building anymore. You're just dealing with these companies that are just like gargantuan. It's almost like Kafkaesque, right? You have to like you're speaking to like a housing manager, but this is just one person in the chain of whatever like corporate command that exists, right? And it's just people are so far removed from the people who actually get to own homes. And that's the thing, right? With the liberal and the conservatives, I think both of them, when we try and think about the actual like sources of this issue of the housing crisis, I feel like both of them have similar ideas about who it is. Maybe there's, of course, there's going to be some distinctions, right? Where I think you can see through the liberal foreign buyers tax or foreign buyer ban. They banned like foreign buyers for and specifically this is something I found. They banned foreign people from buying buildings with less than 3 units. If it's more than that, it's fine. It's fine if you're a foreign buyer. It's fine if you're a gigantic company. That's like we have no problem with that. And I think there's, I guess, the implicit idea behind that, or the kind of
Well, I mean, the
antagonist.
problem is that it's the local millionaires who are like
Of
investing in
course.
second homes and then renting them out or Airbnbing them and so on, who are like hogging the housing, hoarding housing supply basically in order to make more money because it's a speculative market. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean so there's this, it's the same kind of like logic that applies to like certain kind of like, I guess, nationalist proponents, right? Or like whenever nationalism is kind of stirred up, it's not some. I mean, there's of course working class elements in these kinds of movements, but it's mostly just kind of the rich people of that thing who don't want competition from other rich people from other places, right? So it's like whether that's the Canadian nationalism of like that's how I understand it, at least. Whether it's Canadian
uh,
nationalism of like Canadian industries and like rich people who want to be protected from, let's say, the influence of like richer people from the U.S., richer
exactly. Well,
people
I
from.
mean, it's fascinating because you have, all this is happening on the backdrop of like Trump talking about Canada being the 51st state. And of course he knows how to get our goat, and specifically knows how to get the goat of the sort of elites in Canada who are just absurdly like obsessed with their own status internationally, right? They're always
Hmm.
it's the same people who were like spent a decade worrying about whether Toronto was a world-class city.
Right,
um
right.
but it's like that writ large, right? Like they are hyper conscious about their sort of status on the international stage, but they also, they want to protect the fact that they have a state, not because they want to do anything particularly unique or interesting with it, but because it's their like little privileged fief. And so
Hmm.
to the extent that they have nationalism, it's basically just to like protect their little like money making loop. As opposed to, but I think what's interesting is I'm curious what you think of this, but my sense is that in a place like Montreal, the like 51st state thing has sort of landed with a like just kind of a giant collective shrug, like because in a place where you have rent doubling and you have healthcare being eroded and you have like all these different things happening, you end up with um like what is the point of having your own state to begin with if you're just gonna if it's just gonna if it feels like no matter which party you sort of select, that's just gonna keep being eroded and you become more and more like the US, like
Hmm.
and everyone's watching Netflix anyway, which the Bill C-11 hasn't really like increased the amount of Canadian culture on there, or Quebec culture for that matter.
Of course, yeah.
Anyway, I'm curious. My sense is that there's sort of a shrug among the sort of middle to working class, but a freak out among the elite when it comes to these sort of comments and this sort of trolling. Um, uh, but yeah,
Yeah,
what's your
well, I mean,
sense?
it was like the Canadian elites are worried. I mean, most of them. I know there's like Kevin O'Leary, who I think is actively pushing for Canada to become a 51st state, and it's just it's yeah, I guess yeah, it's completely a shrug from most of the people I've seen, except of course like wherever like party leaders and the more public officials who are like worried about being just completely absorbed into by America like a bigger slug. I don't know.
But to bring it back to housing, I think in the '90s or then in the '80s, you did have a sort of you did have a nationalism, and I think you would have seen people sort of sporting their Canadian flag pins to like you
Hmm.
know say like, oh, f you Trump, like we're proud Canadians. Like I think you would have seen a lot more of that, and I think that that's directly linked to the fact that there was like affordable housing, the fact that there was, healthcare, all these things that hadn't seen those extras like 2 or 3 decades of erosion that we've seen today. And I think, I don't know, I would directly link the shrug to that. And if you want people to care about those comments beyond, in the pages of the Globe and Mail or like among or the Gazette, I guess, for that matter, or the elites, you have to give them something to differentiate this state that we have. Otherwise, why
Right.
not just be the 51st state? I mean,
New
like,
boss, same as the old boss.
at this point, I think there would be I think if Canada was literally to become the 51st state, obviously it's not on the table, but it would result in significant losses still. But it would just be sort of a continuation. You can sort of draw the line. You can sort of draw the graph line from like the 1980s to the 90s to the 2000s to now, and like you continue the line a little longer. Excuse me. You're gonna end up in the 51st state thing anyway. So it's like, when are we gonna
Right.
reverse course, right?
No, absolutely. Let's jump on to the next topic.
Sure.
Policy. Let's talk about immigration. Pierre Poilievre, conservatives love talk about immigration. It's kind of a classic scapegoat. The immigrant. Ooh, this other. We in Quebec politics at least we saw Haroun Boise get in trouble for even suggesting that there is a scapegoating of the immigrant as the other. From he got kind of flack from everyone. Everyone in the Quebec Parliament, which is, I think, its own conversation. Federally, of course, conservatives play into this actual really concerning growth among Canadians about the feeling that there's too much immigration, right? And I think that itself, look, nearly half of Canadians favor mass deportations, and 65% think there are too many immigrants. This comes from the National Post. This was released December 12th, 2024. And so I think with that kind of attitude, you
Yeah, it
want to
seems
say
like
something to
there's
that?
basically about a third of people in Canada. Um, and I would venture to say it's probably a bit lower in Montreal, but
Yes.
where you have a higher level of sort of institutionalized multiculturalism and immigrant friendliness, but also just a higher number of immigrants. But there seems to be about a third of Canadians overall who are actively hostile to bringing in new migrants.
I think when we talk about like scapegoating, right, we talk about how the liberals scapegoat, how they create sort of antagonists for these kinds of issues like the housing crisis, for immigration. I think there's quite a note to be made on the concepts and themes that he ties to immigrants, which is kind of like usually it's a classic thing of conservative concerns, and you can see how Pierre is sort of tapping into this kind of rising I don't know, antipathy. No, not antipathy, but like even anger towards immigrants. So we will continue. This is at a rally in Montreal. We will continue to be welcoming to immigrants in consideration of the absorption capacity of housing, the workforce, and our healthcare systems, and we will screen adequately to stop terrorists and others that are against our Canadian values from entering into our country. This is from Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives, and potentially the next Prime Minister of Canada. So, I mean, I think an immediate note off that is sort of you have this kind of like very. I mean, many people have made this. connection, but it's very kind of Trumpy, right? It's very kind of Trumpy where he talks about like the criminals, the terrorists entering the country through the border, right? And it's like there's this kind of like big fear about this, even though most stats on terrorism point that most of the terrorism that actually does happen in North America over the last decade or even more has been right wing terrorism, and it's hardly a thing of a specific kind of like specific to an immigrant kind of identity on these things. But of course, this is I would say this is tied to the war on terror and that kind of tying whatever kind of like black brown people to the terrorists out in the Middle East, and this kind of like enmeshing of those two kind of identities, and of course the fear mongering it comes from that. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that kind of on this comment he made outside of in Montreal rather?
I mean, I think it reflects like an elite, the economic elite in Canada know that you increase the GDP and by increasing the population, and you replace an aging workforce. Like, I think they understand that you need to replace an aging workforce with, younger people, and that means either increasing the birth rate or increasing immigration. And Canada's birth rate is not increasing, you know, probably partially due to the housing costs. So immigration is the answer. And um, and so yeah, we can just put this up on the screen. You have this. This is from RBC, so the Royal Bank of Canada, and they're basically just talking about how Canada's workforce is going to shrink, in 2025, and obviously, immigration is the sort of way that you can reduce that shrinkage of the workforce overall, because people are aging out. And so I think there is a real economic problem that is being addressed by the high level of immigration that the Liberals have sort of not high, but it's actually a normal amount of immigration. But the problem is that people like the people behind RBC, on the one hand, want the economic growth that comes from immigration. They want the competition from more people in the job market filling these positions. They don't want to increase wages to like incentivize Canadians, like landed immigrants or multi-generational people who have been here for multi-generations to like take those jobs. And so they want to, so you keep bringing in, migrants who are willing to do that work that's undesirable for the bigger population. And so they want their cake, but they also want to eat it. They don't want to increase healthcare funding or housing funding or anything else proportional to GDP. And so then you have, Pierre Poilievre turning around and complaining about healthcare funding when, objectively healthcare has been cut pretty much year over year relative to as a proportion of GDP. Like, it's constantly going down. The number of hospital beds is constantly, decreasing proportional to population. If you look at the per capita, like I think we had these dramatic graphs that came out during COVID that show like, I mean, this is particularly the case in Montreal, where like the number of hospital beds is per capita is like on a steep decline. And so, yeah, of course you can talk about the population in growth, like stretching the infrastructure, housing and social infrastructure. But when you're the same person who was cutting that infrastructure relative to the needs of the population, like it's a little bit rich, right? And I think people, that's why you're not seeing a full-throated defense specifically on the demographic questions, which I think are legitimate. Like, I think we do need immigration, clearly, to grow to sort of replace the aging workforce and so on. Um, and then the other thing is that, of course, they want the immigration to be extremely precarious. So when Pierre Poilievre was a minister in the Harper government, they tripled the number of temporary foreign workers, and they reduced the sort of thresholds. They reduced the requirements and the oversight for different industries to bring in temporary foreign workers. They massively increased the number of like, unskilled temporary foreign workers, and these are workers who basically are live in Canada at the pleasure of a single employer. They can't switch
Mm-hmm.
jobs. They can't compete in the labor market the way a landed immigrant or a citizen can. And so they end up being severely abused and underpaid and everything else, and exist in just absolutely horrid conditions in a lot of cases. Living in crowded bunk houses and all kinds of horror stories. And they can be abused in all kinds of different ways by their managers. There's
Mm-hmm.
different forms of harassment. Like it's a real nightmare. But that's the form of immigration that was increased massively, like tripled basically on in just before the Harper years to through the end of the Harper years. Um, and so Pierre Poilievre has very much been a part of that process. But no one's going, like, the journalism. I think the problem, there's a fundamental crisis in the media because they're not going to call them on that. They're not, either because they're not informed or because they don't want to actually bring attention to the fact that that it was that it's this form of migration and this form of de-investment and defunding of relative to population of healthcare and housing that has led to this crisis. And so then
Mm-hmm.
you can, and then the actual individual migrants and their communities become the sort of scapegoats. And then you have, of course, at the same time as Pierre Poilievre's coming through, you have and he's emboldening his rhetoric. I think emboldens these far right groups who are marching. And there was a march in Hamilton where they had a banner that said, you know, mass deportations now, basically echoing
Mm-hmm.
the Trumpian line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been totally legitimized, and of course, the Conservatives are doing nothing to stop that, and actually they've succeeded in shifting the national discourse. So, again, in Montreal and also across Canada, you have anti-immigrant sentiment has become sort of normalized.
Mm-hmm.
At first by the Conservatives who are hammering the Liberals on it, but then the Liberals turn around and sort of blame implicitly and explicitly blame immigrants as well, because they don't want to cop to the fact that they were part of the bipartisan consensus that was cutting housing, that was cutting healthcare, uh,
Mm-hmm.
relative to this population growth, and these things are in crisis now, and so it's much more convenient for them to blame immigrants as opposed to blame their own fiscal policies and their lack of will to tax corporations at normal rates, and have other sorts of progressive taxation that could actually pay for these things, pay for these public services, and for to keep that floor on housing. And so that's how we're in the mess we're in now, I think.
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting to see even like the way that Polyev and this kind of like anti-immigrant bias has in federal politics, right? Because like at the start of the liberal mandate, not this current one, but like let's say back in like 2015, it's like Trudeau and the Liberals are coming to like the Century Initiative, right? Which is like taking in like this massive amount of like immigrants, and that was like a big cornerstone of that kind of policy of like, especially of just like liberal identity, right? For like the longest time of like we're inclusive, multicultural, progressive, and now to see them towards the end, like starting to like backtrack on that, I think it points exactly to what you're talking about, right? Where there's this kind of like we have this our social service system, or so much of our institutions, right? Our government institutions, federally, provincially, even municipally, is sort of like are creaking, or if no, even creaking, they're actively cracking, breaking. People are falling through the cracks, right? And now the liberals, instead of trying to fix those cracks or improve the system's capacity, they're also joining that chorus of okay, less immigrants, and I guess in this last ditch effort to try and hold on to whatever power they can by pacing to that. I think I was so surprised when I saw the liberals backtrack on that. Was it? yeah, even the prime minister admitted it was a mistake. Was it the lack of the feds have slashed Canada's immigration target for 2025 from 500,000 to 395,000, and restricted the number of non-permanent residents who will be able to come or to work or study here. This is, I mean, I think it's a sign of the times, right? Of how deep the liberals are, and how I guess that's what happens when you don't I don't know, bolster our kind of social security nets, or increase
Absolutely.
increase the capacity of hospitals. And I think that's to the credit of Polyev, right, where he's able to take these real problems, these real crises that people feel, right, like waiting room times, um, just the difficulty of getting employment, a housing crisis. These are things everybody feels, whether you're an
Yeah.
immigrant or not, you know. But then Polyev adds on to it, like, and adds on this kind of like mythical solution that reducing immigration, or that getting rid of the immigrants will free up the the space in hospitals, and you have less whatever regular Canadians, you know, will have less competition from these newcomers who are just overloading our system. When in actuality, what these kinds of things do is like it takes away. There's a great study, a podcast about this, where on the big story, it's why are so many immigrants leaving Canada? Where it's not when the idea of like this anti-immigrant bias, right? It's like it's like the idea of removing other patients from the waiting room so that Canadians they have to wait less, you know. But what ends up happening is like it's also the staff that is like taken away, right? It's like it's not immigrants aren't just in the waiting rooms. It's like you're saying they're like this kind of like this talent pool. It's like they're also the labor that supplies they're the people that supplies labor to these institutions as well, right? And that's where I don't know. That's the double edged sword that people don't seem to. That Pierre obviously cannot and will not talk about because it completely goes against the messaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes back to the sort of, exploitative, wealth, non-progressive wealth redistribution agenda of the big banks that are making the case for immigration on the one hand,
Mm-hmm.
and then turning around and lobbying the federal government to, like, you know take every measure possible to not increase public services or even keep pace with demand. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that in the middle of all this, migrant workers in Montreal are protesting. They're saying, like, "Hey, we're being abused here. Like, we're being
Mm-hmm.
mistreated by this temporary foreign worker program." And the same temporary foreign worker program that Lego and others are criticizing, and they're saying, like, "Hey, um, we want the permanent residents when we come to Canada. Like, we should be able to basically, receive benefits for the taxes we pay, but also receive or also have the right to, like, switch employers if we don't like if we're being mistreated by an employer, not to have to, like, literally go back, like, be deported,
Mm-hmm.
but be able to, like, go to a different job, and the right to not be fired if we assert our rights or try to unionize. Like, I think these are actually, crucial demands, if we're going to look at immigration having sort of just outcomes and not creating, like, this sort of hyper exploited class, which then, on top of being hyper exploited, then gets scapegoated. I think that's really the bottom line.
Yeah, it's really rich hearing Pierre talk about like freedom for Canadians when this is going on. When there's essentially like under Harper and his administration, he was essentially like allowing for this kind of like indentured servitude from these like migrants. It reminds me a lot of um the kind of stories of like workers in like Qatar and a lot of like the Arab states have these like workers from like Nepal or India, but they have like the employers, the managers have their passports, you know, and they can't move. There's no freedom of movement. They're not there freely, you know. It's I don't know where's the freedom there, Polyev, you know. That's a question I'll remember to ask him next time I see him, if ever.
Yeah, the veneer of freedom, I think we're going to find
Yeah,
on many fronts with Poilievre is paper thin.
of
And
course. Freedom for who? Freedom for
the
whom?
they each have their own particular flavor of, you know deeply neoliberal hypocrisy.
Classic. Comes in a lot of flavors. All of them taste bad. Drew, you want to talk about the media? media
Yeah,
policy.
absolutely. So I'm gonna run a little clip here. Yeah, I mean, so another thing that's sort of on the agenda, to some extent with the liberal leadership race, but certainly with the looming rise of Polyev, is the effect on the media. So you have the liberals have put in place a number of sort of stopgap measures to try to sort of shore up the like really alarming decline of Canadian media. I mean, you've had like hundreds of actual outlets, of actual like community newspapers and small town newspapers that have closed over the past decade and a bit.
Hmm.
You have hundreds of jobs, I mean thousands of jobs that have been cut in journalism. And so, just to tee that up a little bit, here's an interview I did with Steve Fagey, who's a copy editor at the Montreal Gazette, and who has who's been sort of a long time observer of Montreal's media scene. So I'll just roll that. Yeah, I'm curious. Flashback to 2007 and contrast to now. Like, what's the difference in terms of the amount of coverage that's available and the quality of coverage? Specifically in English Montreal.
In English Montreal, well, you have, it depends on, if you want to get into specifics, it really depends on the medium. For example, I was at I've been at the Gazette since 2005. When I started, they had a national reporter in Ottawa. They had two provincial reporters in Quebec City. They had various beat writers, music writer, a film critic, a bunch of arts reporters, a whole business department. Now it's, we have one reporter still in Quebec City. There's like a couple of arts reporters, one business reporter. So a big thing, especially for print media, is the loss of those sort of beat covering jobs where you have one person who specializes in something. Now everyone's kind of become a sort of all-purpose general assignment reporter. In radio, it used to be the music stations would have, and talk stations would have people working overnights. They have live shows overnights. That's long been a thing of the past. There's a lot more national content on radio because it's cheaper to produce that way. For television, again, loss of a lot of journalists. You have, used to have a cameraman reporter team. That's largely gone by the wayside now. Most part, it's, reporters shooting stuff on their own cameras or even just on an iPhone because it's very portable. And that saves, the company a lot of money, but it results in a less sleek product. It kind of feels sometimes like it's just, we have to get this done. The visual quality isn't that important to us. Let's just, put something out there. So yeah, in various media, you see when you have these cuts, the effect it has on quality, and all the various media are trying to minimize that effect.
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much you can do. So, big stories are still going to get reported, but you're going to see gaps in how much, how comprehensive that coverage is in terms of getting every story, in terms of getting every angle in every story.
Yeah, so that was Steve Fagey talking a few months ago about the sort of the trajectory of journalism in Montreal, and you can really see the impact. And he said earlier on in that interview that like this is really about the bottom falling out of the ad market, basically, because Facebook and Google are hoovering up all those ad dollars. And so, I think as we look at what's happening with Poilievre, you see him sort of taking aim at really across the board at all those sort of liberal policies that have sort of slowed the rapid decline of journalism, such as it is in Canada. So you have pretty small amounts really going into journalism by federal government standards. You have about $50 million going into the local journalism initiative. Full disclosure, some positions at CUTV are funded by the local journalism initiative. And then you have also the sort of the Google money. So again, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Canadian Journalism Collective that is distributing that money. But basically, Bill C-18 made it so Google has to pay some tiny fraction of the amount of money they've sort of sucked out of the news industry, back to the news industry to sort of fund journalism.
That's right. Pay up, Mr. Google.
Exactly. Sergey Brin is giving us the big bucks. So that'll be distributed in a few months to hundreds of journalism outlets across Canada. So Pierre Poilievre has pretty much set his sights on both of these things for cuts, in addition to setting his sights on the CBC for cuts. And he's said some pretty astonishing things. Again, trying to sort of shoehorn everything into his sort of like freedom framework. He called Bill C-18 a censorship bill, and that's a stretch by even the most stretched definition. But basically, the way he's sort of playing that is by saying that because Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, banned news on its platforms in response to this bill, which says they have to pay if they distribute news on their platforms. Because they did that, people are being censored from sharing news on those platforms. And actually, that's just like a free market decision that Facebook as a private actor has made. So it really is actually an expression of the kind of freedom that Pierre Poilievre loves, but he's sort of like spinning it as a lack of freedom. In any case, things are still available on Google, and so I think he has basically said that he would gut that legislation in order to make it so people can share news on Facebook again, which would be pretty profound, have a pretty profound impact, because there's a lot of journalism outlets that are struggling that are about to get a check, from the Canadian Journalism Collective, from Google via the Canadian Journalism Collective that is going to probably have a pretty significant impact on their ability to keep doing what they're doing. But yeah, I mean, the advertising model is in total crisis, and the reader funded model in Canada, and there are a bunch of examples in Montreal of reader funded outlets that have sort of sprung up in the last handful of years. You have the Rover, you have the Breach, you have Pivot, you have North Star, you have different like local media outlets that have really embraced the sort of reader funded model. But the amount of money that's going into reader funding is like a tiny fraction of what was being sort of distributed by advertising, and so you have not seen the business models catch up to anything like so there's sort of an ongoing apocalypse in journalism as the sort of like advertising driven outlets get bought up and then cut down successively by sort of basically two big corporations. Now you have the folks who are doing who own Torstar, who have a whole bunch of outlets, and then you have Post Media, which is owned by a New Jersey-based hedge fund, which has been doing deep cuts to its journalists as well. You have round after round of hundreds of cuts. You have Bell, which runs CTV, cutting like thousands of or over 1,000 people in the last few years. You have TVA doing the same thing. So there's just cuts happening all over the place, and I think the devastation is most noticeable in smaller communities, and ironically, this is something that I think Pierre Poilievre is benefiting from, in the sense that it's when you lose a community newspaper, or when your community newspaper basically becomes like a promotional leaflet with ads, from the local post, from the most proximate viable Post Media product, you lose touch with your community. You lose touch with the civic life. You don't have the ability to, promote local candidacies, to discuss local issues. Like people lose and then what fills that void is sort of rage bait on Facebook,
Right, social
which is
media.
algorithmically sort of tuned to make people angry and keep people on the site for longer, right? And so I think we're seeing, a politician like Pierre Poilievre, who's masterful at expressing anger and masterful at expressing anger specifically through the medium of online ads, Facebook and YouTube and others, and sort of reaching an audience that way. He isn't in many ways the sort of creation of this journalism apocalypse that we've been seeing over the last few decades.
Right, yeah, he's kind of that personified, especially with. I mean, the rage is his whole thing, right? The fact that he speaks to this like rising affect of Canadians, rural Canadians against Trudeau. I kind of wonder. Do you think? But I do think in Montreal, that has less reach, and I think maybe that could be because of the. I feel like there's still. I feel like Quebec has a pretty decent hold on at least this local journalism. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think Montreal is especially protected from that kind of like a strategy from Pierre messaging?
I think Montreal. I mean, I think the bigger media markets are obviously better served because they're because there's so many more people in one place. So you have you can have a local newspaper that's more economically viable. Whereas like in a town of 100,000 or a town of 30,000, Facebook and Google have just like wiped out, like the any kind of local advertising model, and so it has to be rebuilt as a reader funded thing, and you have to build up that culture over time, and it takes maybe decades, maybe it never happens, and so you have news deserts all over the country. Whereas in Montreal, obviously there's still the ability to engage with local issues, even if it's obviously the quality, as Steve sort of outlined there, has really fallen, and the sort of amount of time that journalists, the amount of time and attention. I mean, he was talking about the sort of production quality, but production quality extends to content and the thoughtfulness and the ability to understand issues. And so we were talking earlier about how, why aren't any journalists calling Poilievre on his issues? One is because he won't give them interviews, but another one is because they just don't know, because they don't have time to really understand that nobody's covering beats anymore. People are just covering anything. So they'll go cover they'll cover one topic one day and cover another topic another day, and they'll cover multiple topics per day, and they're literally just repurposing quotes, and they're sort of they're like a format changing AI rather than a journalist. A journalist has to be able to like understand the issue, talk to a bunch of people, take it in, process it, and then filter that through what they think is best for their community to understand, and then deliver that. Like that's a process that takes more than a few hours. You have to be able to reflect.
It takes like years of building relationships with people in the relevant communities, in the relevant sectors. Yeah. I mean, it's a great tragedy, the loss of the beat reporter, right? Because then it's like, I feel like with that, and with the advent of all this kind of like changing topics, you kind of lose that kind of memory that the desk, that the news organization gets to have from having someone just assigned to that one thing, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to glorify the 80s, when people would take limos home from like, late night ink stained writing sessions, and executives were having 4 martini lunches. Like, I think it was manifestly better in terms of the number of journalists that were working, and there was a little bit more space to cover like labor issues and stuff. There was actually a labor beat. Sometimes some papers, even in the 70s or 80s, had like labor sections. So there were things that were manifestly better about it. But do I want a return to the halcyon days of like the Montreal Gazette, when they had the money to like put in those like fancy marble staircases that go up to the second floor and the like brass banisters and stuff? Like, clearly they had a lot of money at one point, and there's still, you can still see the physical vestiges of that. But those beat reporters were subject to the sort of strictures of and limitations of a corporate news outlet that was aligned with elite interests. And I think that's been the case forever, in terms of the media. And I think the real hope is in creating like reader funded, media that has democratic accountability to its readers. And it's interesting because I think Pierre Poilievre, I don't think he's very informed personally about the policy, but I think if you see the Conservatives go in any direction, it's probably trying to create a media model that has more direct connection between economic elites and the creation of media, and I think the sort of bottom up media, the democratic media that has like a certain level of independence to it, is a threat to them. And you see that in the U.S. I mean, things like the Daily Wire just being showered with millions of dollars from, not because they're, I mean, their audience numbers are big now, but they're being regardless of how many views they're getting showered with millions of dollars from these oligarchs who know that having reactionary right-wing views that marry sort of like I don't know, culture war backlash stuff with economic conservatism is a massive benefit to them overall, and so they're willing to put millions of dollars into it collectively. And I think we'll probably see more and more of that in Canada. And I think if I had to guess, I would say probably Pierre Poilievre's vision of the future of media is to defund the sort of nonprofit, democratically run, sort of community-oriented toehold that some media have, and really go hard on the linking up those relinking the oligarchs with the sort of control of the media.
Right. Return of the Yellow Pages and whatever, like the what's his name? The old. It's such like an old kind
Conrad
of
Black.
Yeah, Conrad Black. Yeah,
I mean, obviously,
exactly
Izzy Asper, the moguls of the 80s and 90s. Yeah, they knew which side their bread was buttered on because they were of that class. And I think post media still has that, but it's like, as a sort of a muscle memory. And obviously they're still just they're just being gutted slowly by the hedge fund that owns them, but they're making as much money as they can on the way down.
Maybe we gotta go to New Jersey, visit that hedge fund, try to extol the virtues of
a little road trip.
Media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Take them out for some 4 martini lunches.
We'll do a live broadcast from their little office park.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I always have a feeling that, like, I think whenever I think of like conservative governing, there is that thing of like the individual support, which I think they sort of benefit from. Like, I can imagine like an organization like Rebel Media maybe gaining some like steam or some sort of government money in some kind of capacity, maybe some bolstering with a Pierre in charge. But we haven't seen too much in the way of a media policy for Pierre. Before I know we're running short on time, but what do you think? What do you think are the chances of something like a defunding of the CBC? Because they just got their brand new headquarters in Montreal. Do you think it's likely? What are you expecting from?
I think Pierre Poilievre will do at least what if he gets the majority that he's currently slated to get. I think the CBC, the English CBC, will become like a little stub of what it currently is. The branches will be trimmed. I think he said like they're going to cut like $1 billion, which would be like a 2/3 cut or something from its total budget. And then when you hear numbers like that, it's just absurd. Like I'm not going to defend the CBC in its current state very hard, but $1 billion to like prop up the like civic life and like raise the journalistic standards in an entire country, that's just a pittance to pay. I mean, you're going to see the media market really go south, and the journalistic standards go south. People are going to run wild, because you have cuts everywhere else, and so you're gonna see more explicitly right-wing media and reactionary sort of oligarch funded media sort of move in to fill that gap, right. And it's going to be if he does do it, it'll be pretty ugly, I think.
That's just so many good things coming. That was tough. Thank you, Drew, for joining. Any last comments?
No, thanks for having me, and yeah, look forward to chatting the next time.
All right, everyone. That was Drew Oyaje, Executive Director of CUTV, publisher of The Breach, coming on to speak with me about immigration, housing, and media policy, how it was under the Liberals, and the potentials for them under a potential conservative government. I use the word potential a lot there, but that's it's kind of what's in the air right now. It's the potentials of a new year, new Canadian government, and also potentially new Indigenous policy from the federal government. So to speak on that, I have our new reporter, CUTV's Catherine Ottawa Niquado. How are you doing, Catherine?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. It's a nice sunny day. But
It
on
is.
the not excellent side, that conversation did not fill me with hope.
Yeah. Yes.
So, Pierre Poilievre, conservative government, of course, there's like a history of Indigenous policy under them, or maybe a lack thereof. One of the big things about Justin Trudeau coming into power in 2015 was this kind of like I feel like he really put reconciliation, and at least the I guess the rhetoric of reconciliation and Indigenous community, justice for Indigenous communities, really upfront, right? Whether or not he's actually lived up to many of the promises he's made is something else completely. I know there's plenty of First Nations communities would still have boil water advisories, something he said he would fix in like the first term. We did not do that. And now the new guy who's going to be in charge of the country, but not much better it seems. Pierre Poilievre of the Conservatives Party, MP for Carleton and Ottawa riding. He's gotten some flack in the past for his opinions on Indigenous policy, and I believe he was in 2005, 2006. He was on an Ottawa radio show, and he had some pretty not nice things to say, or maybe not nice. Yeah, maybe not nice. He was talking
Not
about
nice.
residential school survivors and how they should not want more compensation, but what they need is actually a better work ethic. He later apologized for those comments, of course, and I mean, I think he's a little smarter now than he was then. But has his policy changed much? Catherine, I believe you spoke to some members of the Indigenous community. Yourself being Indigenous, what are your thoughts about a potential Pierre Poilievre prime ministership, and what does that mean for Indigenous peoples that you know?
Um, I believe is that for the last 2 decades that he's been on service as like a party leader for conservatives, he hasn't really made good relationships with the indigenous communities. He like with the comments that you said he meant that you mentioned, and also this July in 2024 he attended the AFN General Assembly with the indigenous leaders, and what happened is that the indigenous veterans took turned their back to him against him as a way of like protesting and like kind of like it's not going to be that easy to win the indigenous community over by just making promises. I feel like with what happened with Justin Trudeau, we were he made so many promises that he broke and never like made up with the promises that he's made.
Mm-hmm.
So with Pierre Poilievre, I feel like he's made a lot more outrageous promises. I feel like, and he promised to end the water advisories on reserves. He said he was going to fund the searches for human remains at former
Mm-hmm.
residential schools. And the biggest one that I'm like when I read that in an article is that he wants to abolish the Indian Act, which is kind of I
What a
it's like
promise!
yeah, that's like very outrageous for me because it's like how are you going to do that, because there's a lot of steps to do to like to get to that in what he wants to accomplish. And and also like he what am I gonna say? There's not like with the people that I talk to in the communities, they don't really trust Pierre Poilievre. We were kind of like blinded by Justin Trudeau in the past with
Hmm.
so now we're like more on the how do you say that? We're not really like easily trusting him because
Hmm.
of
On the
the
fence.
relationship. Yeah, we're really on the fence, and he's like with the relationship that he's made in the past with us. It's not like there's no like trust established in that relationship, and we're
Right.
not really seeing any changes coming up. There's I don't know. There was one person in the community that I spoke to that like struck me when they said that is we need more indigenous leaders in the to be a part of the government. But
This is someone in the community who said there should be more indigenous leaders.
yeah, and there's just not enough actions done, and there's too many promises that are being said that it's like it's too much of like I'm losing my words right now,
That's all right.
but there's a lot to be done. There's
Hmm.
we don't really I'm losing my words right now.
That's all right. It's like there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done that the liberals then do, and people are kind of doubtful whether or not Pierre can even. He's not even saying he's going to do it. He's saying other stuff about eliminating the Indian Act, which I don't know of many indigenous people calling for that.
There's not because there's it's like from the 1800s. That's
Right.
like
Yeah.
that's been like made from the 1800s, and it's gonna be too much of a work. Like it's not like 3 years of like abolishing that. There's a
Hmm.
lot to be done, and what I've heard a lot mostly is that Pierre Poilievre is mainly focused on economic. He wants to help the
Right.
indigenous economically, whereas there's a lot issues, a long-standing issues that needs to be like taken care of, like the let's say he did not speak out about the residential school survivors. He did
Hmm.
not speak out about the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, especially the climate change. He did not speak out about that. He mainly talked about giving us economic opportunities, which is very disappointing. And mainly it's like we don't like being a child of a residential school survivors. I really do think that especially getting like what is it called compensation for what happened in the residential schools. My parents thought it was not enough. That was not
Hmm.
enough. They wanted to get justice. They wanted to get actions done. They wanted to get more than just the compensation because that's not. They never thought of like you hurt me and I want money in return. Like
Right.
this is never like what they never asked for that. So it's like that's one more thing where it's like we trust even less Pierre Poilievre for like, you know, we don't want money. We just
Hmm.
want justice. We want to get
Hmm.
actions done. And that's like I want like the indigenous communities want the actions to be done holistically, not just
Hmm.
economically, because we don't really think about money that much.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be all his big thing, right? He's like he wants to get indigenous communities jobs. Which communities are you from or in contact with?
Um, this is mostly like the communities at the student center at Sanahakta
Hmm.
Student
Hmm.
Center at Concordia. So there's mainly like there's a lot of communities like from different nations, and I even spoke about like with some people from Kanawagi as well, and they have
Hmm.
the same opinions on in
Right,
regards
right,
to
yeah.
Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, I feel like you see a lot of Pierre Poilievre, and it's kind of a continuation of kind of like classic conservative ideas about indigenous relations, which is just we need to get them working, we need to get
Yeah.
them like just because you're not doing anything, you're not working, you're not like being productive, it's the classic thing, and it's like you see this kind of mindset in a lot of kind of different like colonial settings across the world. I know in like in China, there's a similar attitude from like Chinese bureaucrats towards Tibetans, which is like where my family's heritage. And the idea is that
Mhm.
like you're just there on the mountain with your sheep. You're not being productive. You're not like adding to society, which is I mean like is who said that's the goal of like being a member of society? I
Mhm.
think you can really I think a classic example. At least for Pierre's kind of policy towards indigenous people, I think it's this thing that you're talking about, right? Economic reconciliation, where he was very, very I guess what's the word here? Like this is about the coastal GasLink pipeline that was cutting through BC and going through Wet'suwet'en territory, where we saw like so much. Was it like the massive protests and the blockades
Yeah.
for it, right? Where Pierre was very against those kinds of blockades, and he was even calling on like indigenous people in the area to like get rid of these gatekeepers. Here, let me get the quote exactly. It really
Yeah.
paid. Yeah, he spoke of removing gatekeepers who stand in the way of development in First Nations communities, citing economic and educational benefits for all of the Wet'suwet'en communities along the coastal gas link who are benefiting from the pipeline. They get jobs, skills, revenue for social services, opportunity for their communities, and independence from Ottawa. So he's trying to sell this idea of like, you got with these big extractive industries, First Nations will be able to like, you don't need Ottawa, you're going to be standing on your own. But it's like, I think for him, he doesn't really understand what's being lost, right? When you allow these big corporations to gain that kind of ground on territory, right? He doesn't really
Mhm.
care about like, I don't know, cultural things, even just the sanctity of nature and keeping it sort of like as is. He wants it to be used for like production, for job creation.
Yeah, he's like I feel like he's like just expecting the Wet'suwet'en community like to just be like, here's our like
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
access to our lands and like just and like I don't know. I really do feel like it's like kind of like a so ironic. I don't know. It's like
Mm-hmm.
very as if the indigenous peoples, like the Wet'suwet'en like communities, would be like, okay, fine, we'll open our land to you guys so we can get money. They
Yeah.
don't want money. They want to like stay home. They want to like get access to their own land and like
Mm-hmm.
be there instead of like just giving it to colonizers.
Yeah, yeah. It's Pierre doesn't recognize that kind of way of living. I guess he doesn't
Hmm.
recognize it. He doesn't understand it. Even I would say I'll go as far to saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we're coming close to the end of the episode for time wise. Thank you very much, Catherine, for joining me for this
Thank you
discussion.
so much.
Of
Thank you
course,
for
of course,
having
of
me
course, of course, and we'll have you on again. You did a great job. Our new reporter, Catherine, Ottawa,
right
Niquado.
from Manawan. Atikamek from Manawan.
Atikamek from Manawan. Shouts out. Shouts
Yes.
out to Manawan. That's the end of this emergency broadcast of Metropolis. Usually we're in the studio, but today we're cozy, comfortable. And thank you, listeners, for
Thank
for
you.
listening and giving us your time.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Good night and good weekend.